The room was full. Laughter echoed across the hall, glasses clinked softly, and conversations overlapped like invisible waves in the air. It was an elegant gathering, filled with well-dressed people and perfectly rehearsed smiles. Yet something felt wrong. Everyone looked too happy. Lucas stood near a table with wine glasses, watching quietly. Not because he was shy, but because something inside him had already stopped believing in that performance. He began noticing details others ignored. A hug that lasted just a little too long to feel genuine. A compliment that carried a hidden tone of competition. A laugh that arrived a second late, as if it had been practiced. It felt as if everyone there was participating in a banquet of appearances. And in that moment, a disturbing thought crossed his mind. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm alone. Maybe the problem is that the world is full of people who are empty. Arthur Schopenhauer once observed something most people still refuse to accept. The more you mix with the crowd, the more you absorb the miseries of human nature. Envy, vanity, silent competition, hidden interests disguised as kindness. Lucas realized this late, but he realized it. As the conversations continued around him, he noticed something unsettling. People weren't really listening to each other. They were simply waiting for their turn to speak, waiting for their moment to appear interesting, waiting for their chance to prove they mattered. And standing there, surrounded by dozens of people, Lucas felt something unexpected, a lucid kind of loneliness. It wasn't sadness, it was clarity. The clarity of realizing that many modern relationships are nothing more than social agreements without truth. Connections built on convenience rather than authenticity. And suddenly, a question formed quietly in his mind. If belonging requires pretending, maybe not belonging is the most honest way to live. This is the uncomfortable truth few people talk about. In a world that grows louder every day, solitude has become a form of protection. Protection from hypocrisy, from emotional exhaustion, from the silent decay of human relationships. And maybe, the reason you sometimes feel out of place isn't because something is wrong with you. Maybe it's because you're one of the few who can still see through the illusion. If this reflection resonates with you, take a moment now and subscribe to the channel. Here, we're not interested in pleasing the world. We're interested in understanding it with clarity. Because once you start seeing the masks people wear, it becomes impossible to look at them the same way again. Lucas stepped outside. The night air felt colder than it should have, or maybe it only felt that way because the noise from inside had finally stopped pressing against his mind. The music from the party leaked faintly through the walls, a dull echo of laughter and conversation that now sounded strangely distant. He walked a few steps away from the building and stood under a dim streetlight. For the first time that evening, he could hear something rare. Silence. And with silence came thoughts that the noise had been hiding. Schopenhauer once wrote that most people cannot tolerate solitude because they cannot tolerate themselves. That is why they chase crowds, distractions, endless conversations, anything to avoid facing their own minds. But Lucas had begun to notice something unsettling. The people inside the party were not escaping loneliness. They were disguising it. Some hid it behind constant talking, others behind forced laughter. Some behind their phones, scrolling endlessly, pretending to be connected. Yet the emptiness was still there, just better decorated. He remembered a conversation from earlier that night. Two men had been laughing loudly near the bar, talking about success, money, influence. But when one of them turned away for a moment, the other's smile collapsed instantly. For a second, his face looked exhausted, almost hollow. That image stayed in Lucas's mind. It was as if the world had become a stage where everyone performed confidence, happiness, and certainty, while quietly carrying something much heavier inside. And the strange part was this: the more people tried to prove they were happy, the less convincing it looked. Schopenhauer believed that human interaction often multiplies suffering rather than relieving it, not because people are evil, but because they are driven by restless desires, always comparing, always competing, always measuring their worth against others. And when people gather in large numbers, those forces only grow stronger. Envy spreads quietly. Egos collide. Authenticity slowly disappears. Lucas looked back toward the glowing windows of the party. From the outside, it looked warm, vibrant, alive. But now he could see something else. A room full of people desperately trying not to feel alone. And in that moment, a realization settled in his chest with uncomfortable clarity. Maybe solitude was not the problem people feared. Maybe solitude was the cure they were avoiding. Because when you step away from the crowd, when the noise finally fades, when the performances stop, you begin to see things you were never meant to notice. And once you see them, it becomes very difficult to return to the illusion. Lucas remained under the streetlight longer than he expected. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty street before disappearing into the dark again. Behind him, the party continued. Laughter, music, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a shore. But now it all sounded distant, almost unreal. The strange thing about seeing clearly is that it comes with a price. Schopenhauer believed that ignorance often protects people from discomfort. Those who follow the crowd rarely stop to question it. They repeat the same habits, the same conversations, the same ambitions, and in doing so, they avoid a painful realization. Most of what society values has very little substance. Lucas had spent years trying to belong. He attended gatherings like this one, laughed at jokes he didn't find funny, nodded during conversations that felt shallow and repetitive. At the time, it seemed necessary. After all, everyone around him was doing the same thing. But slowly, something inside him had begun to resist. Not loudly, just quietly enough to make everything feel slightly off. Tonight, that quiet resistance had finally turned into clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't ask for permission. It simply shows you things. The competition hidden behind politeness, the insecurity masked as confidence, the friendships that only exist while they are convenient. Lucas realized something unsettling. Many people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want environments where their illusions are protected, where no one questions the rules of the game. Anyone who begins to see through those rules becomes inconvenient, difficult, different. Schopenhauer warned about this long ago. The person who values depth and reflection will often find themselves out of place among the masses, not because they are superior, but because they have stopped pretending. Lucas glanced again at the glowing windows of the building. Inside, dozens of people were still laughing, still talking, still performing the roles expected of them. For a moment, a quiet thought crossed his mind. Maybe the reason solitude feels so uncomfortable at first is because it removes every distraction. And when the distractions disappear, something else appears in their place. Truth. The kind of truth that exposes illusions people spend their entire lives protecting. And once someone begins to see the world without those illusions, they start noticing something even more unsettling. Many of the relationships they once trusted were never as real as they seemed. Lucas watched the windows for a moment longer. From the outside, the party looked alive. Silhouettes moved behind the glass, arms gesturing, heads leaning closer during conversations, bursts of laughter flashing like sparks in the night. To anyone passing by, it would look like connection. But Lucas felt something else entirely. Distance. Not the kind created by space, but the kind created by awareness. Schopenhauer once observed that the more a person develops intellectually and emotionally, the more they begin to separate from the crowd. Not intentionally, not out of arrogance, simply because their mind no longer finds comfort in the same things. The conversations feel repetitive, the ambitions feel shallow, The energy of the crowd begins to feel strangely exhausting. Lucas remembered how different it used to be. Years ago, he could lose himself in gatherings like this. The noise, the movement, the shared excitement. It all felt natural. Being surrounded by people meant belonging. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, small moments where conversations felt empty, times when jokes built on humiliation didn't feel funny anymore, moments when people spoke about others with a smile, only to criticize them the moment they left the room. Lucas started noticing patterns, and once he noticed them, he couldn't stop. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back. The friendliness often depended on advantage. Respect often followed status. Attention often followed usefulness. Schopenhauer believed that much of human interaction is driven by self-interest, disguised as kindness. Not always consciously, but deeply embedded in the way society operates. The realization was uncomfortable, because it forced a difficult question. If so many connections are built on convenience, how many of them are real? Lucas had begun to test this question without even realizing it. He stopped reaching out first. He stopped forcing conversations. He stopped pretending to agree just to keep the peace. And something strange happened. The phone became quieter. Messages arrived less often. Invitations slowly disappeared. Certain friendships faded without explanation. At first it felt painful. But with time, Lucas began to understand something that Schopenhauer had warned about long ago. Many relationships survive only as long as you keep playing your role. The moment you step outside that role, the connection begins to dissolve. Lucas looked back at the party one last time. Inside, everything still looked the same, but now he understood something most people spend years avoiding. Sometimes the distance you feel from the world is not loneliness. It is the natural space that forms when you stop pretending. Lucas finally turned away from the building. The music, the laughter, the movement behind those glowing windows, all of it continued exactly the same. The party didn't stop because he left. No one ran outside looking for him. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt. It felt freeing. For the first time in a long while, Lucas understood something that Schopenhauer had hinted at in many of his writings. Peace rarely lives in the crowd. Most people spend their lives chasing belonging. They bend their opinions, soften their convictions, and reshape their personalities just to remain part of the group. But there is a hidden cost to that. Every time you silence your truth to fit in, a small part of your authenticity disappears. Lucas had done that for years without noticing. Until tonight. Standing alone on the quiet street, he realized something important. Solitude was not empty. In fact, it was the opposite. Without the noise of constant approval, without the pressure to perform, without the exhausting effort of maintaining appearances, something rare began to return. Clarity. The kind of clarity that allows a person to hear their own thoughts again, to understand what they truly value, to recognize which relationships bring depth and which ones only bring noise. Schopenhauer believed that the wise person gradually learns to enjoy their own company because it protects them from the unnecessary suffering created by shallow interactions. Not every moment of solitude will feel easy. Sometimes it will feel quiet. Sometimes it will feel unfamiliar. Sometimes it will even feel uncomfortable. But over time, that quiet becomes something powerful. A space where your mind strengthens. A space where your identity stops depending on the opinions of others. A space where you become whole, not because the world accepts you, but because you no longer need it to. Lucas took one last look at the night sky above the silent street. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like someone who had been left out. He felt like someone who had stepped out of something he no longer needed. And maybe that is the real meaning behind Schopenhauer's message. Sometimes the greatest protection in a chaotic world is simply having the courage to walk your own path. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join this community of people who value clarity, truth, and inner strength. And now, on your screen, you'll see another video that dives even deeper into the philosophy of solitude and self-mastery. Click on it and continue this journey of awakening. Because once you begin to see the world clearly, there is no reason to walk blindly ever again.